welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show and the 7th edition of Skiffy and Fanty Clacks,
wherein I become the J. Jonah Jameson of genre and definitely don't honk off any of our listeners at all.
Honk off?
Honk off.
That's what the script says.
Not like piss off or...
Shaun, I'm Canadian.
Is that what you say up there? You instead of piss off, you say honk off?
Have you ever messed with a Canada goose?
Yeah, I'm in America. They're American too. We give them passports. I mean, okay, can we just talk about how silly it is for a second that it's called a Canadian goose? Hey, you probably don't call them Canadian goose, do you?
They're called Canada geese. They're not called Canadian geese. They're Canada geese.
Well, but hold on.
I'm Canadian.
Wait a minute.
It's a Canada goose.
We
I don't
off
understand.
already, listeners.
It's a goose that migrates. So how does it have a nationality to begin with? It doesn't make any sense.
This sounds like a world building question.
How does
the
goose
try to wrestle us back to the topic by main force alone?
How does the goose citizenship system work at all? This needs to be explored. There needs to be an appendix about this.
My mom might know the answer. If my mom were here, she might actually know the answer because she's a bird person. So maybe she'd know, but she didn't show up because she doesn't support me. So thanks, Mom.
Shaun, you said that live on a podcast. Bad, Shaun. No, Shaun, do you realize Sunday is Mother's Day and you've just slandered your mother today for Mother's Day?
Okay,
Game
Paul,
on.
how long have you known me? I slander my mother constantly.
I've known you since 2012?
It's at least that long. Anyway,
At least that long.
I'm Shaun.
I'm Paul.
And I'm Stephen.
And on today's show, we'll be discussing the topic of world building. Or sorry, should I do it as J. Jonah Jameson? World building, threat or menace?
No, Stephen's the J. Jonah Jameson here.
Aren't we all J. Jonah Jameson really deep down inside?
No.
Oh my god, it just almost destroyed my throat. Anyway, we'll follow with a few recent non-genre picks that might be of interest to genre fans. Apparently, we're doing that. So, this now turns to Stephen, because Stephen is going to tell us where this topic actually came from. So, Stephen, go for it.
Yes, so I have recently been thinking a lot about an essay published by Vandra Chandrasekhara on his blog in March of 2023. And, obviously I wanted to fire a few shots at Paul.
Well, before you end my life in a rain of lead, Stephen, a reminder to our listeners. Please share your questions and comments with us about our show at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions, or you can just tweet, or you can just blue sky at us. You can mastodon us. You can connect to us on all sorts of social media and give your questions and comments, because they might get discussed right here on future shows. If you aren't already, you can join us on Twitch for Shaun's Alphabet streams Fridays at 6:30 p.m., just like right now, although it's 7 p.m. of Central, that is, to be part of our interactive live streaming format. Finally, be sure to join our Patreon and be part of our special Patreon-only Discord events on Discord. We have one coming this Monday. It only takes $1 a month. If you donate $20 a month, I won't die tonight.
Yeah. That's curious. I will just say, there's a bunch of stuff about exclusive podcasts and stuff, but I'm just putting this out there right now. If we get to $150 a month by August of this year, I will make members of this show cover Cats from 2019, which is a film.
Oh my God.
A film that I have nightmares about, despite never actually seeing it, because it is one of the most horrific film productions ever made. So there you go. There you go.
Oh dear God. Oh dear God.
Anyway, so that's what you should do. And I guess Stephen will say some stuff about like how else you could support the show. Go for it.
Yes, please tell folks about this show and review us on iTunes or Podchaser or GoodPods or wherever you purvey your podcasts. Word of mouth is a big deal for a fan-run podcast like this one, and we need your help to find new ears for this ridiculous show.
Okay, if people haven't read this essay on world building by Vandra Chandrasekhara, we're putting the link to it in the chat and we'll put it in the show notes. I believe that link is there right now. For now, Stephen, can you give us the quick gist of this essay's argument? Oh, God.
Absolutely, yes. So,
oh God.
Earlier this year, Vandra Chandrasekhara's 2023 essay, The Lone and Level Sands, went a bit viral. It was getting shared around a lot. And that's how it came to my attention. I missed it when it was first written. It was originally written in response to the then current Brandon Sanderson discourse. Chandrasekhara, whose debut novel, The Saint of Bright Doors, is deservedly nominated for basically all the awards this year, and you should go read it. Chandrasekhara is arguing, as I understand it, that world building, and particularly when you combine it with a disdain for ornate prose or sometimes for style at all, and this is a thing that comes up in SFF, where the advocacy for transparent prose, and he suggests that this is at best orthogonal to writing and is often at odds with good writing. He adds that it can be a capitalistic process of generating content to be strip-mined and exploited. That's a strong phrasing that I'm kind of maybe playing a little hyperbole with him there. So I apologize if those aren't his thoughts. Or an urge to simplify the complexity of the world down to a collection of facts that both the writer and the reader can know and control, which is what M. John Harrison, whom Chandrasekhara cites in his essay, famously called the great clomping foot of nerdism. And so I'm just going to directly quote part of his closing here. World building as a totalizing project cannot help but fail. My feeling is that, quote, suspension of disbelief and, quote, secondary world were not helpful ways to think about what is actually happening when we read a text, and yet they are tropes so influential and well established that many of us take them as givens, as expectations of how we should read and what a fantastical text is supposedly doing, end quote. So, as I see it, Chandrasekhara is asking for writing to be writing, for the novel to be a novel, not the foundation of a media empire or expanded universe or an RPG sourcebook. Now, it's a pointed argument, and it takes aim at a lot of cherished ideas in SFF, but it's also one that really resonated with me as both a writer and a reader. And so I thought it was worth discussing.
All right. Paul, say something. Controversial, go.
I've already established listeners and watchers before this podcast that I'm accepting that I'm going to be wrong on the internet here. So I will just read M. John Harrison's notes on world building 2007, quoted in the essay. World building is dull. World building literalizes the urge to invent. World building gives an unnecessary permission for acts of writing, indeed for acts of reading. World building numbs the reader's ability to fulfill their part of the bargain, because it believes that it has to do everything around here if anything is going to get done. Above all, world building is not technically necessary. It's the great clomping foot of nerdism. It's the attempt to exhaustively survey a place that isn't there. A good writer would never try to do that, even with a place that is there. It is impossible. And if it was, the results wouldn't be readable. They would constitute not a book, but the biggest library ever built, a hallowed place of dedication and lifelong study.
Okay, can I say something that maybe one you two, since this is Stephen's topic and Paul cares about it enough to think he's going to lose today. I don't understand. I understand the point that you made, Stephen, your interpretation, and I suppose we should come back to that at some point and get to it. I guess I don't understand what the issue is, because so in reading M. John Harrison, Paul, right, he's talking about, like, to borrow again the language that comes from Chandrasekhara, which is this idea of like the totalizing project of world building, except nobody really treats world building as a totalizing, an absolute project. Every writer I've ever heard of who talks about world building recognizes fundamentally that it's not a totalizing project. It is a partial project. You're trying to make a world feel real enough, but you recognize it is never going to be an absolute project, because you can't do that. And even here in M. John Harrison, right, he's talking about it as if, like, I guess I don't understand what his issue is. Like, if what you want to do is make a secondary world that is different from our own, by necessity, it requires some degree of world building. And the degree to which you engage in that is kind of up to you. So you could go to the extremes of something like Dune, which, is sometimes referred to as like the Tolkien, right? Herbert is thought of as like the Tolkien of science
Mhm.
fiction, right? Which is
Right.
very in depth, down to very minute details. Or you could go with like a lot of other works that are other worlds, but don't really worry that much about those minute, tiny little details. I was trying to think of an example off the top of my head. I don't know, like,
Well, we can just cite the person we were citing. John Harrison's Veraconium is the anti-world building fantasy novel.
okay,
He
sure.
contra he contradicts himself. He doesn't have consistency, and he doesn't give a flying wombat about that.
Well, okay, maybe let's not use that as an example because I might take issue. Because I've never read it. But let's just take another example, like, I don't know, uh, Star Wars, because we've been talking about Star Wars in the Discord earlier, right? Star Wars, certainly has lots of visual world building, but it's not like Lucas spends a lot of time in the first Star Wars explaining all of the world. He gives you just enough of it so that you understand what the big plot point is. But like nobody sits down and like, let's explain Darth Vader's entire story. If anything, that's where Star Wars runs into problems. But that's a different thing. So
Well, well, it may not be a different thing. That might be actually going to Bondra and Mr. Harrison's point. The whole point, movies and properties explaining all that backstory, and that I'm sadly looking at things like Solo and whatnot
hey,
are
you be careful right
never
now.
featured. Or if I understand the thesis that Stephen has brought to this discussion. That is a bug, not a feature, to try to explain where Solo got the Millennium Falcon and all this other stuff.
Right, but this is a
That
problem of like the media like franchise project, which gets to Steven's interpretation, which is the thing I said that I actually understood. But what John Harrison's talking about is not the franchise, right? That's not what
no,
he's
no,
just
he's
talking
not.
about the world building project in and of itself. And a lot of what Chandra Zakara is talking about is world building as a process and the assumptions we have behind it.
Okay, I want to read from M. John Harrison's blog from 2007. When I use the term world building fiction, I refer to immersive fiction in any medium in which an attempt is made to rationalize the fiction by exhaustive grounding or making it quote unquote logical in its own terms so that it becomes less an act of imagination than the literalization of one. Representational techniques are used to validate the invention with the idea of providing a secondary creation for the reader to inhabit, but also in a sense as an excuse or alibi for the act of making things up as if to legitimize an otherwise questionable activity. This kind of world building actually undercuts the best and most exciting aspects of fantastic fiction, subordinating the uncontrolled, the intuitive, and the authentically imaginative to the explicable, and replacing psychological, poetical, and emotional logic with the rationality of the fake. So,
He's just wrong. What? No, I mean, okay. What is he talking about when what fiction does he mean other than Tolkien, who is like our biggest exception? What is he referring to?
He's talking about. Oh, he does mention Tolkien down here.
Sure,
World building is the
okay.
province of people who, like Tolkien, actually resist the idea it's a game and installed their secondary creation concept as an aggressive defense of that position.
Yeah, but most fantasy writers aren't Tolkien. Tolkien's like a mutant when it comes to world building, right? Like most writers
but
are not doing that.
I disagree, Sean. I think that actually Tolkien is kind of. I mean, firstly, Tolkien is everyone's exemplar, and people talk a lot about Tolkien's world building, and they often get it quite wrong because he knew fewer things about the world than of Middle Earth than we tend to assume that he did after the fact. He was always being surprised by the stuff he wrote. He would write until he didn't know what happened next, and then he would sit and think for several years while the solutions came to him, and then he would write some more, and things would often come at him out of left field as he was going through this process. There's, I don't know if either of you have read Tolkien's letters, but there's a famous one where he talks about how he's writing to his son Christopher, and he says, "A new character has come on the scene. I was not expecting him. I did not even want him, but I like him. Faramir." And Faramir was not planned. Okay? Faramir was discovered in the writing process. And Faramir's a pivotal character. So Tolkien was not this make a note about everything, know what's behind every blade of grass guy. He knew his languages because that's what's important to him. But he knew his geography, and he knew his mythology of his world. But the other stuff, a lot of it he discovered. Now, that being said, the impression of Tolkien that it's important to have all these details pinned down before you can properly explore your imaginary world, this sort of popular misunderstanding, I think, is common to a lot of fantasy writers. Look at how many resources there are about effective world building and the importance of particular kinds of world building. And you have people coming for Tolkien because, the material culture of the Shire doesn't make sense. Or, the logistics of Middle-earth are not sufficiently established. And so there's lots of people who not only look to Tolkien as kind of what they should be, but also even think he's not world building enough. And I think that sort of confusion of detail for meaning is the heart of what both Harrison and Chandrasekhara are concerned about, and that's what resonated with me. The idea that, if we layer on more and more detail, things will accrue meaning in and of itself. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, what you were saying right up top, Shaun, was correct. You need enough detail for verisimilitude. You need enough detail for emotional impact. But yet, if your story does not turn on logistics, it doesn't matter where Gondor gets its food. You can just sail right past that and get to the important stuff.
Well, unless the logistics of food is in fact the important stuff, going to the Fran Wild sewage question, which is literally like the infamous interview we did with Fran Wild, where we talked to her for half an hour about sewage treatment, like how you manage your sewage system. Well, that's because it was important to the story she wanted to tell.
It's interesting. Yeah. I'm thinking right now about two works of fantasy, both of which I admire very much, and both of which involve parliaments in a fantasy world. Okay? And one is friend of the podcast, Marshall Maresca's Meridain series, which has a number of books set through the interweaving series that come together to form the overall Meridain saga set in the Parliament. And the other is Aspects by the late M. John Ford, his lost novel, which was recently published in an unfinished, last year, published unfinished. Amazing book if you haven't read it. They're both amazing. I love Marshall Maresca's work as well. And those are very different takes on fantasy parliaments. And Marshall, of course, very much a world builder.
He's on the podcast called Worldbuilding for Masochists. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, and he has thought out all sorts of detail. I've read along with some of his background work on the world of Meridain, and it's great, and it draws me in, and it works. So does Ford's, at least to the extent I know, less world-built setting. And they both work. They're both parliaments. They're both fantasy. Different, I infer, different levels of world building, but they both work because they both deliver the level of detail needed for the story. I've stumped the panel.
No, I'm letting the two of you talk.
No, Paul, you're the world building dork. Get in here.
Yeah, exactly.
We already established that I'm wrong, so...
No, we didn't.
No, you established that you're wrong. I want to hear what you have to say. All right, that's why we're here.
Yeah. Fight to the death. No, this is the moment from the Godzilla movie when Ken Watanabe comes out and says, "Let them fight." Like, this is the moment. Let's go.
I'm just going to punt and look at the comments in the chat instead. Cartero is points out that Tolkien would have been happy to world build forever and never tell a story. I mean, in certain aspects, I mean, when it comes to languages and his maps, yes, and his songs, I'm not sure Tolkien really cared about the economy of Moria and never would have built it.
I mean, I would agree that in general, Tolkien's world building interests are very particular.
Very particular and narrow.
Yeah, certainly. There's certain things he doesn't care about.
Mythology, but they're very deep on those on the shaps of world building that Tolkien wants to do. He goes very, 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 very deep.
Yes, but I think it's because of what the sources he draws from, right? He's drawing from like the Poetic Edda and the epics and
right. So he's thinking deep shafts of world building for the things he's interested in.
Well, hold on now, Paul. Hold on. You keep saying you're wrong. What is your position that you think you're wrong about?
I mean, I get the thesis of Vondra, and of course, M. John Harrison says that world building is worthless is not the right word, but futile, counterproductive to fantasy, not something that we should not focus on. I mean, it's like the real danger of world building is that practice in literary form. This is a science fictional root of I'm quoting from root of long-termism, the clomping foot of the boy demiurges attempting to build a world of the world.
Yeah, that's his position. What's your position? That's his position. Stop pussyfooting around the bush here. Come on.
Cartero's asking that my position is wrong.
No. What is your position? Not is your position correct? What is your position?
I'd rather hear the two of you.
No. Position. I'm gonna pull this root canal out right now. Let's go. What's the view, Paul?
Cartel, to answer your question, I believe now that my lifelong interest in world building has been wrong.
You're M. John Harrison right now. We're asking you to describe what your position is, and you're saying nothing that tells us anything about it. We're all confused. What is the position?
I'm not sure my position is that interesting.
Paul?
Anyway,
I'm going to drive, I'm going to leave the stream running and I will drive 4 hours south and I'm going to hold your face to the webcam and get you to say what your damn position is. What's your position?
Let's go back to the piece.
Oh my God. Okay. Oh my God. I've never been teased so much in my life.
Okay. I'll just say it. My position is juvenile, puerile, uninformed, and
those are characteristics. What's the actual view?
I like lots of world building. That makes me wrong on the internet.
No. It doesn't make you wrong. Do you genuinely like lots of Paul? Genuinely, do you like when you read a book and it has lots of world building?
Yes.
Does it make you happy?
Yes, but
if I wrote an epic fantasy,
Harrison and Vondra pointed out, that's
no.
That's not.
Who cares?
Intellectually defensible
you know what?
position.
Vondra can go burn in hell right now.
No,
not really. I don't actually know you, so please don't take that personally. But no. Serious question, Paul. I've written 2 novels right now. One of them, I just made it all up on the spot. Didn't even think through anything. It's wildly inconsistent. The world doesn't make any sense. Characters change names randomly. And the other one, I spent 15 years meticulously building a reinterpretation of the fall of the Roman Empire into an epic fantasy about dragons. Which of those 2 are you going to read?
If you said, Paul, I have to read one of those 2, I probably would read the second one.
Okay. That tells me, Paul, not that you're wrong, you have a personal preference.
Right, but that personal I mean it's the classic New Yorker phrase. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Too bad yours is wrong. In this case, it's too bad mine is wrong.
I don't think your opinion is wrong.
I get where Vondra and M. John Harrison are coming from, that, world building for the sake of world building is detrimental to, I mean, they're not even going into the problems of getting stories on paper, which is a whole other thing we could talk about. But their position, as far as I can interpret their essays and their words, is that meticulous world building is detrimental to the whole project of science fiction and fantasy. That's the way I read this. Like, if you're going for the minutia of world building as a practice in the literary norm, you're up. I mean, as Vandra says, world building is a totalizing project, cannot help but fail. My feeling is that suspension, disbelief, and secondary world are not helpful ways to think about what's actually happening when you read a text. And it's
okay.
Now,
you are pushing me, Paul. You are pushing me, Paul, to actually switch my position just so
I did go on World Building for Masochists, which is Marshall's podcast, and I did talk about world building there. And I'm going to reiterate some of the stuff I said there. I don't know. I remember my exact words, but I pointed out that world building in the end is a Trompe-l'oeil. Do you know what that is?
No, explain.
It's an artistic term where you have a painting or a work that looks like it's more than it actually is. I mean, the Romans did this all the time. They would paint the walls of their rooms in this effect so they looked like you were sitting in the room and you could see the garden painted on the walls. But it's an illusion. It's not actually there.
Okay.
You can't world build every single detail, no matter how hard you wanted to, because you can't even world build our own world. Do you know every detail of everything you're in? No, you don't. You can't do that. So my opinion is you need to, at least to make me happy as a reader, world build enough that I get the Trompe-l'oeil effect, that I can believe that there's a world out there.
Right.
The so-called Larry Niven playground of the imagination. I can believe that I can walk out of the Shire and go north and find stuff. I mean, we never go there in any of the books, but I could believe I could do that.
Right. You want the illusion of depth because the actual depth is not possible.
The actual depth is not possible. I mean, it's kind of like trying to take a photo that shows depth. In the end, it's a flat image, and there's not actually any depth there. It's just a physical image. But I want the illusion to see that there's a world out there.
I'm just gonna tell you that I fundamentally disagree with
disagree with whom?
Shunner Sakara and also M. John Harrison. I agree actually with Stephen's interpretation. The idea that if Chandra Sakara is asking for, as you quote it, Stephen, writing to be writing or the novel to be novel, that it doesn't necessarily have to be more than just what it is. I would agree that if that's what Chandra Sakara is really getting at, that I don't think that we need to drop the alternative where things are becoming, the illusion of depth, or becoming these massive media empires or expanded universe, whatever we want to call those. But to suggest that doesn't need to be the only or dominant mode of, in this case, we'll just say fantastic literature. I would agree that making that the dominant mode is perhaps harmful only in the sense that it means that other forms of expression get squeezed out of the equation, right? Which I would agree with completely. I think M. John Harrison's more wrong than Chandra Sakara, but that's because I think M. John Harrison Chandra Sakara points this out in the article, sort of responding to that rejection of the literary prose, which you mentioned very much at the beginning, which I understand exactly where that's coming from, because science fiction's been in this weird pull between these very different axes, where on the one hand, they're trying to legitimize the genre, and yet are being attacked for being not literary, not being true fiction, and all of these kinds of things. But then, of course, when the new wave sort of surfaces and we start seeing that push to say, well, SF can express itself in different ways, or fantasy can express itself in different ways, and use beautiful prose and other kinds of things, well, then there's that opposite push now happening where people are saying, but that's not what we want to read. We want populist fiction, essentially, which we still have today, arguably is just as virulent as it was in the 60s and 70s. Because I remember the sad rabid puppies, and you could tell from a prose perspective what they were ultimately arguing for. Yeah. So,
and
yeah, go ahead, please.
I agree with you, Shaun, and I think that Harrison in particular was coming from a particular time and place and series of experiences. His own experience at the tail end of the new wave, and his experience in sort of being instrumental in establishing not the works of, but the idea of the new weird. I don't know if either of you read the paper by Helen Marshall that Chandrasekhara linked to in his essay, but it's fantastic. It's fantastic, and it takes a really deep look at Harrison's position in world building and where it came from and what was going on to sort of, as sort of an impetus for it. And, the long and the short is he was very much making a point in a very public and direct and fiery way. And, that's fine. That's what people do on the internet. But, it's certainly theatrical and probably overstated. But now what Chandrasekhara, and again, talking about positioning, Vajra Chandrasekhara was coming out of that absolutely cursed Sanderson discourse, where, where it was like, oh, here's my profile of Brandon Sanderson. He's kind of a dork, but he's really successful. And that was just, that was so boring, right? That was so boring and so irrelevant. There's legitimate grounds to have a conversation about where you critique Brandon Sanderson's work. But, the fact that he's, his personality, his demeanor, the way he presents himself, the fact that he's a family man whose whole job and only real passion outside of his family is his writing. Those are not very interesting things to poke at someone about. And that was silly. But there was a lot of conversation because of that about Sanderson's writing. Which I think you can have an interesting conversation about. And Sanderson is very much the heir of both world building in our genre. He's one of the most prominent faces of world building, and he's also one of the most prominent faces of very just get the job done, transparent prose. And where those things come together is, I think, what Chandrasekhara is particularly interested in, and it's what I got particularly excited about. Because I have been going through a phase this year where I have been really hungry for prose that ticks more of my boxes. Prose that makes me work a little harder. And I found that in The Saint of Bright Doors, which is it's just a fantastic book. And by the way, it has a lot of detail, a lot of world building. Chandrasekhara works to build his world, the city of Luriat, and it's a fantastic book on both a prose level and on a level of verisimilitude and believability and depth of setting, and those are all ways that you can say world building. So there's an irony there, right? It's a great book, and it shows that his position is somewhat nuanced because he engages in this process that he decries in his essay, but he doesn't use it as an excuse to not make the reader work or to confuse remembering details with depth of prose. It's just it's a great book on every level, but it shows the reconciliation of these two positions, right? Because you can have a vivid, well-realized, deep setting with all sorts of relevant details. His prose is good, and his world building's good. He does both. It's great.
Okay, so...
Okay.
Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, they've been having weird things.
I want to read something from Michael Moorcock.
Oh boy.
I think the notion of world building is a failure of literary sophistication. Take the romantic writers of the 19th century, particularly the Brontes. The Brontes love the idea of depicting weather to suit moods. It's called the pathetic fallacy, where you give inanimate things, animate qualities. The point of that style of writing is that it used landscape and weather, all exteriors, to symbolize internal conflict within the individual, within a small group of individuals. I only invent what's necessary to explain the mood of a character. I haven't thought about an imaginary world's social security system. I don't know the gross national product of Melnibone. If world building is sophisticated working out how a world interacts in and of itself, I don't really have any of that. People learn to interact in my worlds. Where do the systems interact? The weather system is always supposed to show what's going on inside the character. That's why I don't see myself as a world builder. The world unfolds in front of the character as the story develops. If the story doesn't need it, it's not there.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a valid counterpoint to the whole project of world building, but I mean, Moorcock has been, sort of setting himself up as the anti-Tolkien,
Yeah.
For a
particularly ever
long
since.
time, yes. I've read some of his essays, yes.
Yes, and listen, I don't know if anyone here has read Shaw's Better Than Shakespeare.
No.
Okay, so George Bernard Shaw wrote an essay called Better Than Shakespeare, where he said, I'm better than Shakespeare. And that is very much the literary tradition that Moorcock is operating in here. And with his famous essay, Epic Pooh, where he sort of comes out guns blazing for both Tolkien and A.A. Milne and compares the two to Tolkien's detriment. And, it's theatrical, it's fiery, it gets attention. Is it actually a particularly defensible argument? Of course it is. He's a very smart guy, but it's not the be all and end all.
So this is a problem, in the literary world in general, which is like discussions of what constitutes good writing. We're talking about it from a world building perspective because, to some degree, all of the people we've been citing are talking about world building as a thing that can make or break good writing in genre fiction. But in the broader literary world, they will talk about, in very firm terms, notions of what makes good writing. And that might move anywhere from largely indefensible positions about the status of prose, right, which prose matters, or
Hmm.
moving through things like theme, or sometimes you get vague ideas of like values. Charles Altieri argues largely about values in literature, but he doesn't necessarily mean personal values. He's talking about like moral values or moral attitudes that are exhibited in stories. Not necessarily because the stories themselves are morals per se, although some of them would certainly be. And the problem with all of this is we're ultimately beating around the bush about the question of taste, because every single person is going to have a difference in taste. And what I'm hearing a lot of this, whether the people arguing these positions are saying it, is they don't like what other people's taste implies, in terms of their values of fiction, right? Of what fiction they like to read. And they
Hmm.
would like them to not have that as the only focus of their taste. And I will agree with them in the way I said before, which is when it comes to creating a narrative where there certain types of writing are acceptable and other types are not, right? In the broader sense of what constitutes a genre, that becomes a problem. But when we're talking about people's tastes, we're in a really murky territory. As is noted in the chat bar Arturo Serrano, right? That Paul is, your tastes are your tastes. What you prefer in your fiction is ultimately, nobody can tell you that your tastes are wrong. I mean, they can, but they're just it's an indefensible position, right? We're now in this weird spot where how do we actually talk about this in a way that is not just people battling over their personal tastes or their personal preferences, or as Arturo also says in chat, right? Writers essentially insisting that the way they write is the way that is best. And that is, I don't know that we're going to get an answer. We can maybe pontificate one among ourselves. I don't know that any of the people that we've mentioned, whether they intend that to be their perspective or not, I don't know that they have the answer to it. I give Chandrasekhara the respect to assume that he doesn't take the view that only his way of writing is the best, but maybe he wants to do, as Stephen has been saying, be a little fiery, be a little bit of a, you know, look.
And he's responding to Brandon Sanderson as a writer and a world builder.
Right.
So so he's
Well, and the
being
profiling.
pointed
Yeah, the
right in the profiling.
profiling of Sanderson. This idea that Sanderson is the face of fantasy is already kind of a problem because Sanderson is such a very particular mode of fantasy that does not constitute even the bulk of what kinds of fantasy are even being written today. And I can understand when we look to Sanderson what potential concern there may be for being rather reductive about what fantasy can be. And it's a thing we need to
I
be
mean, I
careful
mean,
about as a community. Paul, please.
I mean, the whole idea of his Brandon Sanderson's laws of magic. I mean, that's
Yeah.
not the only. That's far from the only way to do a magic system in your books. Yes, if you want a scientific, quote unquote, rational fantasy, Brandon's laws work for you. But there are plenty of authors and writers who are fantasy where there's a lot more chaos in their magic, and it's not reduced to rules that you can work out. I mean, there are lots of people who like to work out those rules of magic and work the interstices. Oh, I think in one of his books he even has like almost like a chart of the elements of magic in one of his books. I have not read. You'd be surprised, listeners and watchers. I have not read as much Brandon Sanderson as you think I have. I mean, you'd think I would be. I've read every single Brandon Sanderson and then some, but um, I mean, it's not like I bounce off his stuff. It's just that it doesn't really engage me in passion in a way that other authors do. I would rather read um to
Kate
go another
Elliott,
person who worlds builds heavy.
Arthur Wells.
Yeah, but Kate Elliott is someone who worlds builds extensively, but I'd rather read Kate Elliott's prose than Brandon Sanderson's prose. I mean,
What?
for one,
Yeah.
for one thing, Kate Elliott's characters are better. Come
Ah!
at me, internet. Come at me, internet. I know. I've just said no. You see. It just took an hour for me to actually get my actual real opinions out.
Yeah.
Brandon said I can't think of a Brandon Sanderson character offhand I like, which is nuts. It's like there's there. Where's the wily Persephone and the unconquerable sun and many other Kate Elliott characters come leaping off the page at you, sometimes quite literally.
Yeah.
But I mean, no one's going to accuse Kate Elliott of not world building extensively. So you see, this is like, I mean, but she doesn't. I mean, she's not making a systematized magic system. I mean, there's lots of room for mystery. I'm going to go with the word mystery here.
Well, you're describing kind of the problem that of reductive, like making people the
Right.
face of a genre can help create a reductive sense of
Right.
what constitutes the genre,
Right.
right?
Well,
Reducing magic
yeah.
systems down to, well, if it doesn't have a magic system like what Sanderson does, therefore magic bad. And it's, well, that's actually, if anything, a failure on the part of the reader, because that is a misunderstanding of really how magic conceptually has been understood throughout history, in human history, like real history,
hmm
even to this day. Where, I mean, I remember I was in an African literature class in graduate school. Apollo Amoko, who's a professor at the
hmm
University of Florida, um, from Kenya, if I recall correctly, and he
hmm
was talking about anthropologists, American Western anthropologists going to like these remote villages and these peoples that still lived, the way that their ancestors had lived, largely in these homes, and trying to explain to them that what they described as magic was just coincidence. So, like, if a house fell off its stilts and killed somebody, they would go, well, like the spirits or magic was involved in this, and he would say, well, that's just coincidence. It happens. And what he didn't realize was like magic to them and coincidence were the same thing. They were coincidence was essentially a force that was unknowable and unexplainable, and that's what
hmm
magic was. It can't be systematized. It's impossible. And for many peoples around the globe, that's just the way the magical fundamentally is. It is an unknowable. It is a thing that can't be quantified, in the same
It,
way that, like, Tolkien often has magic where, like, it exists, but there's not like a magic power bar above Gandalf's head that tells you how powerful he is. We just know he becomes more powerful because he like ascends or evolves to different levels. But we don't actually know what the full extent of that power actually is. We just know that he's powerful. There's a mystery to his power.
Yes.
I guess what I'm getting at is like by taking that as our example, it just feels like so reductive to a point of almost boring. Right? It's not that I don't like magic with systems. I think they can be very interesting. It's just that if that's what most fantasy becomes as a consequence, not necessarily because Sanderson's trying to personally do it, but because
Right.
readers are doing this by making their choices, that to me just results in a more boring fantasy.
A more monoculture.
Yeah,
Like this is the
monoculture.
one true way, and this is what we're going to plant. We're going to plant thousands
Yeah.
of acres of Sandersonian magic systems.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
exactly.
Yeah.
Oh dear
But
God.
Stephen, please
That would
jump in. Yeah.
Oh no, I think that's absolutely correct, Shaun, and it really goes to the importance of, you know, the way that world building, when it works, is the same as not world building when it works. It leaves space for the imagination, and it leaves space for the reader to be a participant in the making of the story, which is something else that both Chandrasekhara and Harrison in his somewhat more sedate moments of that collection of thoughts get at, which is that it's important for the reader to be a partner, and leaving space for the reader to imagine, whether that's because you give them specific details or don't give them specific details, is really valuable. And, the reader bringing themselves to the work is valuable.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Vondra and Harrison are afraid of world building that is so total or attempts to be so total, although that's as they both point out, that's impossible. And I've pointed out it's impossible. I think they're afraid of it being so much that the reader doesn't have the room to imagine because everything has been already defined and put out there when the reader can't build into that playground of the imagination I talked about at all because it's all because the signposts and the markers are all already up already, and you can't go there, you can't imagine anything new because it's all been laid out for you. This goes into a whole idea of a completely different topic. Are fantasy maps good or bad?
They're
And
horrible.
the anti-position, I'm going to argue the anti-position is the anti-position doesn't the reason why fantasy maps are bad, listeners and readers, everyone knows I'm a big fan of fantasy maps. So I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. The bad thing from the Chandrasekhara Harrison point of view about fantasy maps is that basically it locks down things, or let's even we can go Diane Wynne Jones for that matter. It locks down things that have nothing to do with the story, and it confines the imagination of the reader to possibly a detrimental extent because the geography is now all mapped out there for you. You can't imagine it in any different way because there's the map. It shows you that town is 10 miles from that town, and you can't imagine any other way or imagine your own version of the landscape because it's been mapped out there. The whole map is not the territory problem. It's like that's again an idea of what world building stifling the imagination, stifling the reader, and as you were saying, Stephen, kind of like getting in the way of that collaboration between the reader and the writer. So oppressive world building, it's a map can stifle the creativity of the reading. God, I'm not an academic. You're the academic, Shaun. I'm just a
No. I'm not coming at this from an academic perspective. I'm just coming at this from reason. Because like the way I look at a map is I have a choice as the reader whether to view the map. Whereas with the prose, I don't. I have to read the prose, right? And if I'm going to read the book, that's a requirement. whereas I can skip the map. Um,
I don't know if any. Well, maybe there are people who skip maps that are in books. That's a really good question. I'm curious. I've never done that, obviously, because my point of view. But I wonder if there are people actually read fantasy novels and they avoid the map entirely.
well,
Do
I
you
wouldn't
really?
say I avoid it. I just don't necessarily. I mean, I flip by it. I don't
Now, now,
spend
now,
time
now,
at it.
here's an interesting bit because I read a lot of review copies, and
Hmm.
they're books that actually will have a map. That future version will have a map, but I don't have a map when I read that review copy.
Yeah.
And sometimes what I imagine is very different than the actual map I actually get when I actually see the polished book.
Well, and that can, I mean, I guess to some degree it can have the effect of taking that away if you make the conscious choice to spend time with the map. But if the
My
writer is an effective writer, they've left you plenty of other opportunities for imagination that the map can't cover.
that you
It's not
don't
a map for the territory problem because what you see on the map may not be a perfect representation of what you read in the story.
we're kind of switching topics. I mean, maps and their uses and their problems are a completely different subject than a whole who makes the map, what's that map depict, doesn't it depict? And
Well,
I
it's still
mean,
world building. Yeah.
is world building, but Cortaro points out it's too much work for him to constantly refer to the map when he's reading, and that's true.
Yeah.
I think if you're having to constantly refer to the map when you're reading, it is my opinion that the writing isn't as good as it could be, because I think the map should be a benefit, a bonus, an adjunct, an add-on, not a necessary thing to,
Yeah. Yeah.
unless you're talking something like, say, a battle map, like or something of a really short terrain that where it really matters, like the map in Joe Abercrombie's The Heroes, for example. I think there's a map in there. I'm not sure. I'd have to go check. That is and then that goes to the whole point of audiobooks and the lack of maps. And what do you do about that? That's another problem
Well,
entirely.
I think for me, the bigger question here that is being raised by all of us is when we're talking about that issue of the loss of imagination through world building, this is
Mhm.
actually probably where the criticisms of Sanderson's prose are more relevant. The issue with Sanderson is not actually his world building, but it's whether or not his prose functions in a way that allows the reader to imagine, or is it so workman and so direct that it actually takes away the imagination. To me, the prose is more important than the world building. And in some degree, Carturo said earlier in chat that he mentioned Hemingway, that like Hemingway to some degree has rotted the heads of many writers. And I would actually agree, maybe not, I don't know if it's necessarily for the same reason Arturo says in chat, but I would agree for the reason that I think what people have taken from Hemingway is the wrong lesson. Hemingway is known for having very sparse prose, right? It is
Mhm.
very, very direct, very simple, easy to understand prose. But the thing that Hemingway is also most known for is the thing many writers ignore, which is sometimes referred to as like the iceberg effect, or there's a variety of different names to it. He described it. Many people who've read his work have described it. And it's this idea that, yes, you might have a sentence that is completely understandable and direct and specific, and you can read it just on its own terms and be fine. But underneath that, there are things that are not being told to us by the narrator, by the writer, that we have to deduce. And the example I use all the time, and I probably use it on this podcast, is Sun Also Risings. Because in
Mhm.
that book, if you've ever read it, the injury that the main character has received is never explicitly explained, ever, in the book. Nobody ever comes out and says exactly what his injury is. We have to deduce that from the clues based on how he behaves, the activities he doesn't engage in, why he doesn't engage in them, and those kinds of things. And if you pay attention to those clues, you start to figure out that all of this thing about him not wanting to be in love with Brett, the woman he wants to be with, who he can't be with, and you're always just sitting here going, well, why can't he be with her? He keeps saying he can't be with her, and they want to be together. Well, that's the thing. If you're deducing all of those clues, you figure out it's because of his injury has made it so that
Mhm.
he's impotent, right?
Yeah.
Hemingway never tells us that. And I think that I like what Hemingway does with prose. I like Hemingway a lot. A lot of people don't like him. Whatever. You're all wrong. It's fine. I like what Hemingway does, but I think the thing that people need to understand about Hemingway is that simple prose does not just mean simple expression. There is complexity and depth there. And if that is where good writing and good world building comes through. And that's what I would like to see us looking at more is how do we tell great stories using these prose stylings? How do we tell great fantasy stories with prose stylings like this that leaves those opportunities for us to explore and imagine while still telling, and exploring a fantastic world?
I see Carter has given links to an NJ Jemison essay
Yeah.
on why magic doesn't make sense and Brandon Sanderson's First Law.
Yes. Yeah. And those will be essays. I'll put in the show notes for those because I think they'll be interesting to read. So
Yeah.
There's a ton of great responses to Harrison, responses to Sanderson, responses to Chandrasekhara. All of these things kicked off tons of discourse, and some of it was not cursed. Some of it was actually really good.
Yeah. So I think we have to wind down, and that means we need to get to those non-SFF picks that I guess you're gonna tell us about, Steve. What's this? What is this?
So, well, when we were talking about subjects for this podcast, one of the things I thought might be interesting was non-SFF picks. What things we've been reading that are maybe of interest to genre readers, but that are not themselves inherently genre. And that gets just always a fun conversation. I mean, for instance, ever since I started reading contemporary romance, it's been a fascinating process. I've learned so much, and I've read a lot of really great books. The thing I'm mentioning today is not a contemporary romance, but I do recommend contemporary romance as a genre. It's lots of fun and is very interesting, and a lot of it's really emotionally intelligent. But no, I wanted to sort of say, hey, what are some things that are, you would not necessarily come across in your regular sort of the regular connections that lead you from one perhaps work in genre to another, but to something that's near it but not of it. And for instance, if I could just go ahead with my pick, I've been reading the works that were recommended as because they are finalists for this year's Lambda Literary Award in the LGBTQ plus comics category. And some of those works are genre works, obviously, because there's lots of genre in comics, but not all of it, or at least it's not all SFF. And the work I wanted to mention tonight is Lawrence Lindell's Blackward, which is a YA graphic novel that is not genre, but it is a warm and funny celebration of Black queer joy, as 4 young Black people work to find and create community for themselves and for everyone like them who's, and this is a quote, Black, queer, and weird. Blackward itself is a portmanteau of black and awkward. Now, the work doesn't shy away from acknowledging the pain of being rejected by people who you hope to be in community with, who maybe don't accept you or your identity, but it focuses on joy and friendship, intergenerational mentorship, community support, and coming together in celebration. The art's bright and distinctive, and it perfectly evokes the theme of joy. It's just a happy time to read, and I'm so glad that I came across it.
Okay.
Fantastic. Paul, do you have a book?
Well, I read many books. So something that's not science fiction.
Yeah.
Okay. I will go with a book I recently read called After 1177 BC by Eric S. Klein. Eric S. Klein's previous book was 1107 BC, which was about the Bronze Age collapse. This book is a sequel to that book where he basically looks at what happened to the societies in and around the Eastern Mediterranean after the Bronze Age collapse. Did they how did they come back? Did they fall apart? Did they evolve? Did they change? And he basically goes around the Mediterranean looking at basically what happened to all because at the height of the Bronze Age, we had a number of very interesting kingdoms and polities running around the Eastern Mediterranean, interacting each other in very interesting ways. There's a book, trying to remember the name of the author. I think it's Amanda Passani, called Brotherhood of Kings, which basically we found this whole treasure of letters between these various kings, and they basically it was kind of like a very early proto international world system, although international running from Greece to Turkey to Palestine to Egypt. Basically, these kingdoms kind of trying to figure out how we're going to get along with each other or not get along with each other, and that whole society went kaplooey in the so-called Bronze Age collapse. And what the Bronze Age collapse is still being debated how and why that happened. But in this book, Klein looks at what happened to Egypt, to Assyria, to Palestine, to Turkey, and to Greece after things collapsed. And some societies some societies kind of limped along. Egypt kind of limped along for a few hundred years, winding up getting dynasties outside of itself. Assyria kind of trying to make another go at it. The Hittites went completely collapsed. Greece, we had the height of the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, and the Dark Age of Greece. That's where we get Homer from. He's from the Dark Age of Greece, and them remembering basically the height of the Bronze Age. And then, of course, he points out some polities did very well. I mean, a obscure set of hill tribes in Palestine became the Jewish state in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse. So he kind of looks at how these or the Phoenicians, which kind of weathered things and then went off and founded Carthage. So how societies react to massive systemic change and collapse is kind of the point of this book. And I really enjoyed him kind of giving a tour of the Eastern Mediterranean and what we know now about how these different societies muddled along, did better, or went completely into the toilet and were never seen. I mean, the Hittites collapsed so completely that several hundred years later, when Xenophon marched out of the Persian Empire, there was these hills and mountains of ruins, and not even the people there knew what they actually were. So it's like when things fall apart, they can fall apart really badly. And so it's like they had no idea until we started digging in the 19th century who the Hittites really were, except for some mentions in the Bible. It's like they collapsed so completely after the Bronze Age collapse and the rise of the Iron Age. And it was a fascinating bit of history. And I recommend his first book, which of course is 1177 BC, which is the story of how and what we know so far, how and why it is. I mean, for a long time, I'm babbling along. We thought it was just called the Sea Peoples, but it's a lot more complicated story than just the Sea Peoples running around the Mediterranean. Who are the Sea Peoples anyway? That's a good question, but it's a much more complicated story, and what happened afterwards is much more complicated than has been previously discussed. So
it was Paul. Paul was the Sea People.
Yes.
No,
Going around.
I'm not. I am
toppling
not
civilizations.
I'm not a sea person. Thank you.
All right.
If you say so.
Was it? Yeah. Yes. Tripping Mass. Yes, that was the Sea People thing. Although it was much more than just roaming people running around. There's climate change and drought and other things that kind of all intersected. Kind of. I mean, Klein puts it like a perfect storm.
Oh, you can't give us a whole history lesson.
Yes, I can.
Paul's
yes,
about
I
to
can.
go
I can
on
give a
the
whole
lecture
history
circuit right now.
You didn't want to talk before, and now it's the end of the pod.
Who knew all we need to do is like, hey, Paul, tell us about the ancient times. Paul would give a freaking sermon.
I'm sorry. I'll shut up now.
Oh, it's awesome. It's awesome. I want to read these books now.
Oh my god, like Stephen, you're so apt. Like earlier it's like pulling teeth from you, and then it's like, hey, tell us about the Hittites, Paul, and you're like, let me tell you about the ruins. Like it's amazing.
It just we needed to get the right topic. That's all it was. We needed to hit the right topic
No,
for
the
him.
Worldbuilding is the right topic. I just feel a little oppressed by the tone of this Clacks, which is why I was on the back foot.
Well, Paul, we love you.
I don't know about that, but thank you.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, I'm gonna drive. I'll drive 4 hours south after this. It'll be fine.
You are not. No, you're going to stay there and watch the Aurora in a couple hours.
If you say so. Okay, well, I'll mention my book, and I'll be
She
very
mentioned your
brief,
book.
but mostly because there's not as much depth in terms of the level of detail required for Paul's sermon. As we say, Paul's sermon on the Mount podcast.
Oh dear God. Oh dear God.
I'll mention a book that I've actually taught before, and probably people have heard of because they will know the author, which is Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which is
yes.
a graphic novel of basically of Alison Bechdel's life, obviously dramatized to a degree, dealing with her coming out and discovering of her father, who also turned out to be gay, and some of the interesting life lessons and weird experiences she had, of course, told in comic form. It is referred to as a family tragicomic because naturally, what Allison may have experienced in being able to come out was not necessarily something the generation of her father would have been able to experience. So it's a very interesting book. I do strongly recommend it. There are a number of other interesting books in this same category, but I just think that Alison Bechdel's Fun Home is a very exceptional book, and I recommend it strongly.
It is
Okay.
at that. Have you read her follow-up book about her mother and about
Not yet.
about therapy?
No, I own it, but I haven't read it yet.
It's a little bit less focused, maybe,
Okay.
than Fun Home, but it's a really powerful work in its own way.
We'll have to check it out. It's in my collection somewhere. All right, folks. That's the show. So as a reminder, if you would like to let us know what you thought about this episode, you have a comment, or you'd like to suggest a topic for Clacks, for example, or for anything that we do, you can go to skiffyandfanny.com/listener suggestions, or you can send us an email, skiffyandfanny@gmail.com, if you'd like as well. Either one is fine. Skiffy and Fanty is here on Twitch at twitch.tv/skiffyandfanty, but we're also on most of the social media sites, Blue Sky, Instagram, Mastodon, and Threads. And you can find all of those links, including links to our Patreon and our newsletter, which is run by Stephen here, at linktr.ee/skiffyandfanty, which is the link tree. And please do support the show at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty and leave reviews of the show if you could, please, because we need more reviews to feel happy and accomplished in life. That's important. For me, I am at ShaunDuke.net. I'm also on the same Twitch channel, twitch.tv/alphabetstreams. I stream my stuff Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central. Skiffy is every Friday at 6:30 p.m. Central. And then I also have a Patreon, and I'm on most of the socials, and my link tree is just /Shaun Duke. That's Shaun with a U.
You can eligibly find me across the internet as Prince Justin with a V, PRINCEJVSTIN, from book reviews to podcasting to streaming to sharing to photography to babbling about ancient times and much more.
I am on Blue Sky as at Stephen GM. Stephen has a PH, as he is right and proper. My comics reviews appear monthly on the Skiffy and Fanty site, and I am very pleased to share that my flash fiction story, The Last Thing They See Is Laika, will be published by Lightspeed Press, Lightspeed Magazine, online, both in text and narrated in podcast form, on May 16th of this year, 2024.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Good job, Stephen.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, as required by the Skiffy Fanny bylaws, I need to make it awkward. And so it is with great pleasure that I announce that starting in June 2024, I am organizing this and bringing it to the world. It is the Paul Weimer Lecture Circuit. It'll begin with a lecture specifically about what's with all the olives in ancient Greece. That'll be his first lecture. His second lecture will be, did the Romans really like it? And then there will be a final lecture on this circuit that'll just be specifically about roads. And that is spelled both with an H and without.
I could talk about roads.
I know you
Roads.
could. Yeah. So that'll start in June. We will be in Eastern Kentucky, Oklahoma, and briefly we will be in California, but probably in what's that town? Temesca? What is that place called? Yeah, but
Which
I don't
one?
know. It's some place that like probably has poison water. It's fine. So there you go. And
Oh,
on
dear.
that note, awkward ending and scene.